I lost my grandson during a visit to the White House in Washington, and my daughter-in-law Sarah called me irresponsible. She blamed me for everything, destroyed me publicly, and I carried that guilt for 15 years. But what they found in 2023 beneath the streets of D.C. proved that some monsters don't lurk in dark alleys. They wear uniforms, carry keys, and hide in plain sight in the places we trust most. When you think about child disappearances, you probably imagine playgrounds, shopping malls, maybe a park where a kid wanders off for just a second. You don't think about the White House, one of the most secure, most surveilled, most protected buildings in the entire world. But that's exactly where 7-year-old Ethan Miller vanished without a trace on April 15, 2008. And for 15 years, nobody could explain how a child could simply disappear from inside America's seat of power. I have spent years researching missing children cases, diving into cold cases that haunt families for decades, and Ethan's story is one that challenges everything we think we know about child safety and the places we assume are secure. This isn't just another true crime story about a missing child. This is about how a fractured family, a devastating accusation, and a horrifying discovery 15 years later revealed a predator operating in the shadows of our nation's capital. Ethan's grandmother, Maggie, became the villain in her own family's nightmare, blamed and ostracized for a tragedy that wasn't her fault. His mother, Sarah, let grief and rage destroy the relationships that should have supported her through the worst moment of any parent's life. And the truth that finally emerged from forgotten tunnels beneath Washington, D.C. exposed a security failure so massive, so unthinkable, that it forced the FBI to re-examine decades of unsolved cases. What happened to Ethan Miller isn't just a cautionary tale about missing children. It's a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself, that the systems we trust can fail catastrophically, and that sometimes the answers we desperately need are literally right beneath our feet, waiting in the darkness to be discovered. This case will make you question everything you thought you knew about child abduction cases, about family dynamics under unimaginable pressure, and about how one man's knowledge of forgotten infrastructure became the weapon he used to steal innocent lives. The story you're about to hear involves shocking revelations, heartbreaking family tragedy, and a truth so disturbing that when it finally came to light, it changed how we think about security in government buildings forever. Because Ethan Miller's disappearance wasn't random, it was calculated, methodical, and enabled by a system that forgot to lock the doors to its own basement while the whole world watched from above. I'll never forget April 15, 2008, the day that tore my family apart and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about missing children cases. I was researching cold cases when Ethan Miller's story landed on my desk, and honestly, it hit different. This wasn't just another child disappearance statistic. This was a 7-year-old boy who vanished in one of the most secure locations in America, the White House. His grandmother, Maggie, had volunteered as a chaperone for his second-grade field trip, excited to spend the day with her grandson exploring the halls of power. The morning started perfectly. Kids buzzing with excitement, teachers doing head counts, and Maggie holding Ethan's hand as they walked through the East Wing. But somewhere between the Blue Room and the State Dining Room, in a crowd of about 40 students and parents, Ethan simply disappeared without a trace. One moment, Maggie was pointing out a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, and the next moment, her grandson was gone. The panic that followed was immediate and absolute, the kind that makes your blood run cold when you realize a child has vanished. Secret Service agents locked down the entire building within minutes. Every door sealed, every visitor accounted for, every staff member questioned. They reviewed security footage from dozens of cameras, interviewed every single person in that tour group, and searched every closet, bathroom, and corner of the White House. Maggie was hysterical, screaming Ethan's name through the corridors, while agents tried to calm her down and get coherent answers. The other kids were terrified, crying and calling for their parents as the reality of what happened sank in. Within an hour, the FBI had deployed their child abduction rapid deployment team, treating this as a potential kidnapping at the nation's capital. But here's what haunted investigators from day one. There was no footage of Ethan leaving the building, no suspicious individuals lurking around, and no logical explanation for how a 7-year-old could disappear from the most surveilled building in America. The search expanded beyond the White House by evening, covering the entire National Mall, surrounding buildings, and even the Potomac River. Hundreds of law enforcement officers combed through Washington, D.C., showing Ethan's photo. A freckled kid with sandy brown hair and a gap-toothed smile, wearing a red jacket that should have made him easy to spot. News helicopters circled overhead as the story broke nationally, with every major network covering what they called the White House disappearance. Maggie gave a tearful interview that night, begging whoever had her grandson to bring him home safely. But back at the Miller family home in Arlington, Virginia, the atmosphere was far from united. Sarah Miller, Ethan's mother and Maggie's daughter-in-law, wasn't just worried. She was furious, and that fury was aimed directly at the one person she believed was responsible for her son vanishing. I've covered dozens of missing children cases, and one thing I've learned is that tragedy doesn't just break families. It tears them apart in ways that never fully heal. Sarah Miller didn't hold back her anger, not for a second, not even when cameras were rolling and the whole country was watching. She confronted Maggie right there at the police station, her voice raw with grief and rage, calling her mother-in-law irresponsible, negligent, and unfit to have ever been trusted with Ethan. The words she used cut deeper than any investigation could. "You lost my son. You lost my baby. How could you let this happen?" Sarah's husband, David Miller, tried to play peacemaker, but even he couldn't hide the accusation in his eyes when he looked at his mother. The family dynamic became part of the story itself, with tabloids running headlines about grandmother's guilt and family blame game. What should have been a united front searching for a missing child became a public spectacle of finger-pointing and fractured relationships. Maggie retreated into herself after that confrontation, barely speaking to investigators and refusing to do any more media interviews. She hired her own attorney, not because she was guilty, but because Sarah had already convicted her in the court of public opinion. I've seen this pattern before in unsolved cases where there's no clear suspect, no obvious perpetrator, so families turn on each other because they need someone to blame. The Miller family stopped communicating entirely within weeks of Ethan's disappearance, with Sarah refusing to let Maggie attend the prayer vigils or search parties. David was caught in the middle, losing both his son and his mother in one devastating blow. Friends and neighbors took sides, with some defending Maggie as a loving grandmother who'd made a tragic mistake, while others agreed with Sarah that she'd been reckless and inattentive. The community of Arlington was divided, and every true crime forum online had threads debating whether Maggie should face charges for child endangerment. The psychological toll on Maggie was visible and heartbreaking. She aged years in just months, her hair turning completely gray, her eyes hollow with guilt and grief. She stopped leaving her house except for mandatory FBI interviews, where agents pressed her repeatedly about what she saw, what she remembered, any details she might have forgotten. They asked the same questions dozens of different ways. Did anyone follow you? Did Ethan seem scared of anyone? Did you notice anyone paying unusual attention to the children? Maggie's answers never changed, but investigators kept digging, wondering if maybe she knew more than she was saying. Some online sleuths even floated conspiracy theories that Maggie herself had been involved, that maybe this was a custody dispute gone wrong or some twisted family secret. The accusation alone was enough to destroy what little remained of her relationship with Sarah, and honestly, watching families implode like this while a child is still missing, it's one of the darkest parts of working these cold cases. Does this work for you, or would you like any adjustments? The FBI threw everything they had at this case, and I mean everything. Hundreds of agents, forensic teams, behavioral analysts, and some of the best investigators in the country. They started with the obvious suspects in child abduction cases, registered sex offenders within a 50-mile radius, anyone with prior kidnapping charges, employees at the White House with questionable backgrounds. Every single staff member who was working that day got interviewed multiple times, their alibis checked and rechecked, their personal lives examined under a microscope. Security footage was analyzed frame by frame, with experts looking for anything suspicious. A lingering glance, an unusual movement, someone who didn't belong. But here's what made this case so frustrating for investigators. The White House is designed to be one of the most secure buildings on Earth, and somehow a 7-year-old boy had slipped through the cracks without triggering a single alarm or appearing on a single camera after that last sighting in the state dining room. Lead investigator Detective Rachel Morrison told reporters that this was unlike any missing child case she'd ever worked, and she'd been handling these investigations for over 20 years. The typical patterns weren't there. No ransom demand came through, no witness reported seeing Ethan being led away by an adult, no abandoned clothing or personal items were found. They brought in cadaver dogs to search the White House grounds and surrounding areas, fearing the worst but finding nothing. The Potomac River was searched by dive teams, the sewer systems beneath D.C. were explored, and abandoned buildings throughout the city were systematically cleared. Ethan's face was on every news channel, every missing persons database, every Amber Alert system across the country. Tips flooded in by the thousands. Supposed sightings in California, Florida, Texas, even one claim from someone in Canada saying they'd seen a boy matching Ethan's description. Each lead was investigated, each tip followed up on, but every single one dead-ended into nothing. The investigation expanded to include psychological profiles of everyone in Ethan's life, looking for any indication of who might want to take him or hurt him. They interviewed his teachers, classmates, neighbors, family friends, even the mailman who delivered to his street. Sarah and David's finances were examined to rule out any possibility of staged abduction or insurance fraud, though both parents were quickly cleared. Maggie underwent multiple polygraph tests, all of which she passed, but that didn't stop the public speculation or Sarah's accusations. The FBI set up a dedicated hotline and offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to Ethan's recovery, later increased to $250,000 as months passed without progress. But despite all the resources, all the manpower, all the expertise thrown at this case, investigators had nothing solid to work with, no viable suspects, no clear motive, and no trace of where Ethan Miller had gone after disappearing inside America's most protected building. Does this work for you? Or would you like any adjustments? When a missing child case goes cold, it doesn't just fade from the news, it haunts everyone involved in ways that never really stop. The first anniversary of Ethan's disappearance brought renewed media coverage, with Sarah doing tearful interviews pleading for anyone with information to come forward. But by year 2, the coverage had dwindled to occasional mentions on true crime podcasts and annual memorial posts on social media. The FBI kept the case open, technically, but the dedicated task force was dissolved and agents moved on to newer cases with fresher leads. Detective Morrison never stopped thinking about Ethan, though. She kept his photo on her desk and would periodically review the case files, hoping something new would click. I've talked to dozens of investigators over the years, and they all say the same thing. The cases that go unsolved are the ones that keep them up at night, the ones they carry with them long after retirement. For Morrison, Ethan Miller was that case. The one that got away, the mystery she couldn't crack no matter how hard she tried. Maggie lived those 15 years in complete isolation, estranged from her son David and permanently cut off from Sarah and any grandchildren born after Ethan. She moved out of Virginia entirely, settling in a small town in Pennsylvania where nobody knew her story or recognized her face from the news coverage. Friends who tried to stay in touch said she became a shell of herself, barely speaking, rarely leaving her small apartment except for groceries. She attended therapy for years, working through the crushing guilt and the trauma of being blamed for a tragedy she couldn't prevent or explain. Some days she'd convince herself that Ethan was alive somewhere, maybe taken by someone who wanted a child and was raising him under a different name. Other days, darker days, she'd accept that he was probably gone and that she'd never know what happened in those few minutes when she wasn't holding his hand. The psychological weight of not knowing, it's something families of missing persons describe as a special kind of hell, worse than grief because there's no closure, no grave to visit, no definitive end. The Miller family never recovered from the fracture that started the day Ethan disappeared, and honestly, most families in these situations don't. David and Sarah eventually divorced in 2014, 6 years after losing their son, because the grief and blame had poisoned everything between them. Sarah remarried and had 2 more children, but friends said she was never the same. Overprotective to the point of paranoia, never letting her kids out of her sight, homeschooling them to avoid field trips and public outings. David moved to Oregon and cut contact with almost everyone from his old life, unable to face the memories. The case became one of those unsolved mysteries that true crime enthusiasts obsess over online, with Reddit threads and YouTube videos analyzing every detail, proposing theories ranging from plausible to completely absurd. Some people still believed Maggie knew more than she'd admitted, others thought there was a White House cover-up, and a few even suggested Ethan had somehow gotten into the underground tunnel systems beneath D.C. and gotten lost. But without evidence, without new leads, the case just sat there in the FBI's cold case files, another missing child, another family destroyed, another mystery that seemed destined to never be solved. March 2023 changed everything, And I mean absolutely everything about what we thought we knew regarding Ethan Miller's disappearance. A construction crew working on renovations to expand the Smithsonian Metro station near the National Mall broke through into an unmapped section of the old steam tunnel system that runs beneath Washington, D.C. These tunnels are remnants from the early 1900s, originally built to transport steam for heating government buildings, and most of them have been sealed off or forgotten for decades. The crew foreman, a guy named Mike Torres, was the first to notice something wasn't right when his team breached the wall. There was a small backpack wedged against some old piping covered in dust and mildew, but unmistakably out of place. Torres initially thought it was just debris from decades ago, maybe something a maintenance worker had left behind, but when he pulled it out and unzipped it, what he found inside made him immediately call the police. Inside that backpack were a child's belongings, a water bottle with Ethan written in marker, a crumpled permission slip for a White House field trip dated April 2008, and a small toy car that still had a price tag from a gift shop. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement and reopened a case that had been gathering dust for 15 years. The FBI's evidence response team descended on that tunnel within hours, setting up lights and carefully documenting every inch of the space. What they found was beyond disturbing. The tunnel system connected to an access point near the White House grounds, one that had supposedly been sealed since the 1970s, but showed signs of being opened and used much more recently. About 30 feet from where the backpack was found, investigators discovered something even more chilling. Scratches on the tunnel walls, small handprints in the dust, and remnants of a child's red jacket torn and discarded in a corner. The jacket matched exactly what Ethan had been wearing the day he disappeared, down to the stitching pattern and the logo of his elementary school. Forensic teams collected DNA samples, fiber evidence, and began the painstaking process of mapping out these forgotten tunnels to understand how they connected to the White House and surrounding buildings. Detective Morrison, who'd retired 2 years earlier but never stopped thinking about Ethan, was brought back as a consultant on the case. She told reporters that in all her years investigating missing children, she'd never seen anything quite like this. Evidence suggesting that Ethan had somehow accessed these underground tunnels, either by accident or because someone had led him there. The question that haunted everyone was simple but terrifying. How does a 7-year-old boy end up in a sealed tunnel system beneath one of the most secure areas in Washington, D.C.? Investigators began reviewing the original case files with fresh eyes, looking at building schematics and maintenance records from 2008. What they uncovered was a massive security oversight that had gone unnoticed for years. There was an old service entrance in the White House basement, one that connected to these steam tunnels, and while it was supposed to be locked and alarmed, maintenance logs showed inconsistent security checks. Someone with knowledge of these tunnels, someone who had access to that basement area, could theoretically have used them to move through the building undetected by cameras and security personnel. The breakthrough came when investigators cross-referenced White House maintenance staff from April 2008 with individuals who had knowledge of the old tunnel systems beneath D.C. What they found made everyone's blood run cold. A man named Robert Bobby Clemens, who'd worked as a maintenance supervisor at the White House from 2006 to 2010, had previous employment history working in the steam tunnel maintenance division for the city. Bobby had unrestricted access to the basement levels of the White House, knew every service corridor and forgotten passageway. And according to coworkers, he was obsessed with the history of DC's underground infrastructure. He'd left his White House position in 2010 under quiet circumstances that nobody had thought to investigate thoroughly at the time, and he'd moved to West Virginia, where he'd lived a relatively quiet life until his death in 2019 from a heart attack. The FBI obtained a warrant to search his property, and what they found in his basement was the stuff of nightmares. Journals detailing his fascination with the tunnel systems, sketches of routes through the underground, and most damning of all, a small collection of children's items, including a school ID that didn't belong to any known family members. Forensic analysis of the evidence found in the tunnels, combined with DNA recovered from Bobby's property, painted a horrific picture of what likely happened to Ethan Miller on that April day in 2008. Investigators believe that Bobby had been watching the tour groups that came through the White House, looking for an opportunity, and when he saw Ethan separated from his grandmother for just a moment, he acted. He likely told the boy something convincing. Maybe that he was there to help find his group, maybe that there was something cool to see, and led him through that unsecured basement door into the tunnel system. The scratches on the tunnel walls, the torn jacket, The position where the backpack was found, all of it suggested that Ethan had tried to escape, had realized something was wrong, and attempted to find his way back. But these tunnels are a maze, pitch black without lighting, and a terrified 7-year-old wouldn't have stood a chance of finding his way out. The evidence suggested Ethan had died in those tunnels, likely from dehydration and hypothermia, within days of his disappearance, while hundreds of people searched for him above ground, never knowing he was right beneath their feet. The closure brought by this discovery was bittersweet, and honestly, it shattered what remained of the Miller family in new ways. Maggie, who'd spent 15 years carrying the weight of blame and guilt, finally had vindication. It wasn't her negligence, it wasn't a moment of carelessness. It was a predator who'd exploited a security flaw and stolen her grandson in a place where everyone should have been safe. Sarah had to confront the reality that she'd spent 15 years punishing her mother-in-law for something that was never her fault, that her anger and accusations had destroyed their family unnecessarily. David received the news in Oregon and reportedly broke down, realizing he'd lost both his son and his mother to a tragedy that could have been prevented if the White House had properly secured those old tunnel entrances. The FBI issued a formal apology to the Miller family and announced sweeping changes to security protocols, ensuring that every access point, every forgotten corridor, every potential vulnerability in government buildings would be identified and secured. Bobby Clemens couldn't be prosecuted because he was already dead, but investigators found evidence linking him to at least 2 other unsolved child disappearances in the D.C. area from the 1990s cases that were now being reopened with fresh urgency and new understanding of how this predator had operated undetected for years. Ethan Miller was 7 years old when he disappeared, and he deserved so much more than what happened to him in those dark tunnels beneath Washington, D.C. His story isn't just a statistic in the database of missing children. It's a reminder that every unsolved case represents a family torn apart, a life stolen, and a community forever changed. Maggie Miller spent 15 years carrying guilt that was never hers to bear, and Sarah Miller spent those same years directing her grief at the wrong person, destroying relationships that could never be rebuilt. The truth came too late for their family to heal, too late for Ethan to come home, but maybe not too late for us to learn something crucial about how we protect our children and who we trust with their safety. I want you to think about something tonight. How many other forgotten spaces exist in buildings we consider secure? How many other predators have exploited our assumptions about safety? The case of Ethan Miller exposed a vulnerability that had existed for decades, and it makes you wonder what other security failures are hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered only after another tragedy occurs. Robert Clemens operated undetected, trusted with access to one of the most important buildings in America, and he used that trust to commit unspeakable acts. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how many other Bobby Clemens are out there right now, wearing uniforms, carrying credentials, moving through spaces where children should be safe? This case also forces us to confront how we treat families when a child goes missing. Maggie was vilified, accused, and abandoned by the people who should have stood by her, all because we need someone to blame when the unthinkable happens. How many other family members have been destroyed by misplaced accusations? How many relationships have been shattered by grief that turned into rage? The Miller family's story is a cautionary tale about how tragedy doesn't just take the victim. It takes everyone connected to them, tearing apart the very support systems that should help people survive the unsurvivable. If Ethan's story affected you the way it affected me, I need you to do something important. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because these cases, these missing children, these unsolved mysteries, these families still searching for answers, they deserve to have their stories told. Every week, we dive deep into cases like Ethan's, uncovering the truth behind child disappearances that the world has forgotten. Some of these cases are still active, still unsolved, and your awareness could be the key to bringing someone home. What happened to Ethan Miller was a tragedy, but letting his story fade into obscurity would be an even greater injustice. So I'm asking you, will you help keep these stories alive? Will you help make sure that no missing child is ever forgotten? Subscribe now, and let's continue this journey together, because every child deserves to be remembered, and every family deserves the truth.